I left Penang at the age of 17 and came back in my mid-40s, about 30 years later. And I think that because I've always lived in the heart of Georgetown, in the core parts of the UNESCO heritage site, the Penang that I left 30 years before and the Penang that I came back to was essentially unchanged, physically. What changed for me was the fact that the intangible heritage of the area, the district that I grew up in, had disappeared. So in one generation, modernization and development had meant that all the practices, not all, but a lot of it had all disappeared. And that was very sad. But the physical buildings were all still here. They were decaying, but they could be restored. So what could not be restored was people's belief and faith in the cultural and spiritual and religious practices that was going on in the precinct. I basically grew up around here, Mantri Street. My family home was around here, in this street. I went to school down the road, so the same street. So basically, I came back to the street where, I grew up in. So 360 degrees, and 30 years later, I ended up in point zero. Well, I grew up, got myself a career, got an education overseas, and basically, well, in my mind, I basically made enough money to do what I wanted to do in that 30 years. I was a professional banker. I was a fund manager, investment manager, based in Australia. That allowed me to have the financial freedom to do what I wanted to do in my middle age. So that was basically what I did in the 30 years. I sort of traveled the world. I got myself very much involved in doing all the things that I love doing, which is like visiting palaces, castles, European museums, learning about art, life, and history. And not knowing that it would help me put all that into context when I was doing up these Peranakan houses. Having the knowledge base about what period things were, what the design references were about, was all preparing me for this moment. Coming back to Penang was the last thing on my mind. When we leave for greener pastures, or what I thought was greener pastures, you never thought that you end up in point one, in the same spot where you left. I think I would have lost a lot of money if someone had taken a bet with me that I would end up here, the same spot. Even my parents were very surprised. You just can't plan these things, right? You can't plan that your banking career was going to end when you're in your early 40s. It ended because I made sure that I didn't get another job when my bank was taken over. It ended because I wanted to see what else there was to do, I could do in Asia. I left Asia and had spent most of my time in Australia. So, it's wanting to reconnect back to my roots in Asia. And funnily enough, that initial connection was not in Malaysia, it was in Sri Lanka. It was where I thought I saw an opportunity, and it was a great opportunity. It had very similar history to Malaysia. The Portuguese, the Dutch, the British. The only thing that it lacked were the first Chinese migrants that came. So there was really very few Chinese that went to Sri Lanka. But the boats did sail there. Admiral Cheng Ho did stop in Gaul in the 16th century, and You know, the similarities in Malaya of my mind and Sri Lanka was so similar when I landed the shores in Sri Lanka in the early noughties. I came back because I wanted to get to know my mother again. She was in her 80s and had become widowed, and I thought that it was a great chance for me to look after her because I had been away for so long. And while I was doing that, I began to see the beauty of the old Georgetown again. And that was even before UNESCO had inscribed Georgetown as a World Heritage Site. I actually, where I'm sitting now in this house was the first house I bought, and that was about in the year 2006. And that was like 2 years before the inscription of by UNESCO. And even the inscription by UNESCO was a total surprise for all of us, because I know that we had made, Georgetown, Penang had made an attempt for inscription in the year 2000, and that was rejected. So I didn't think that they would resubmit again together with Malacca. Yes, I think the UNESCO thing, but that was a few years later. I thought it was the right time because people were starting to be aware of the inner city, the beauty and the heritage that they had here. Because, and for the first time, one could buy into the heritage area here because they were under the rent control for a long time, for 40, 50 years. And when that was repealed in the year 2000, finally these properties came up for sale for the first time. And so being in the right place, because for the first time these properties came up for sale. And also it reminded me so much of what I had done in Australia, in Melbourne and in Sydney. In Melbourne, especially in the early 80s, late 70s, I was starting to participate in the gentrification process of the inner city, inner suburbs. In Melbourne, it was Fitzroy, it was Carlton, Parkville. Basically, I focused on the areas around my university, which is the University of Melbourne. And, you know, I had learned and had restored a few houses because I was so swept up and caught up in that whole movement to gentrify the whole inner city. So to confront that, to be confronted with that opportunity again, one generation later, in 2005, when I first came back here, it was quite extraordinary to think, wow, I can see history repeating itself. It was all just people were just starting to get interested in these old properties, but it was still early days. The inner city had emptied out because of the rent control being repealed. So rentals were going up and businesses were dying off because of the rent increases. But it was also the first time that these places became available. So I think this house was my experiment at whether the sort of restoration I wanted done could be done. And of course I found that it could be done really well. It could be done also with the skills that I learned in Sri Lanka, which is a lot of salvage work, a lot of upcycling, a lot of reuse of resources, because it's such a poor country. They had to, you know, salvage and reuse everything that they could get their hands on. So yeah, that was what I found, what I meant when I said it was the right time at the right place. And also, I think I have to say that Malaysia and the whole of Asia went through a really bad economic downturn in the late 90s when the currencies collapsed across Asia. And it had not recovered. Even by the year 2005, 2006, it was had still flatlined. Pricing had still flatlined, and it was looking really good value. I have to start with, like, the first property I bought was this one, just to create my home. Then an opportunity came up at that time there was no UNESCO World Heritage Zone. So this was Clove Hall. Clove Hall was in Clove Hall Road. And I went to the auction, and it was incredibly good value. No one bid at the auction. So I bought the property, and I thought, okay, I'll play around with it. And it was a black and white colonial bungalow. So very different to what I've done recently. Well, what I've done in the last decade. And I love the romance of the black and white bungalows because they're just, such a unique time in history when the colonials lived and graced these homes. And this was a completely rundown property that, I had a lot of fun playing around with and created the first 5 or 6 room boutique hotel in Georgetown. Chong Fat Si, the Blue Mansion, had already opened up by that time. So it wasn't the first, I suppose, but it was the first, I suppose, purpose-built boutique hotel to a certain extent. It was adapted from an old bungalow. It was a men's club, actually. And I still have very fond memories of that property because, I created a lot of beauty there, and I thought I was very happy to see the end result and the impact it had on a lot of people. So, the early work that I did in Penang did influence a lot of people in terms of their investment decisions to come here. And I'm very proud to have led the way. It had no personal connection. It just was random property that came out on half an acre of land. And when I did more research into it, it was where the Sarkis brothers, the Armenian brothers, where they had their home, the first home. And it was in a Clove Hall plantation. They had a Clove Hall plantation there. And I just come back from Sri Lanka, where cloves are really part of the whole, everyday flora. So cloves and cinnamon, very much part of Sri Lanka. I just come back from Galle, and that house reminded me of the first boutique hotel I stayed at when I landed in Galle, which is the Sun House. And so it was easy to sort of like picture the Sun House and recreate, that blissful period when I first landed in Sri Lanka. So that was my first commercial foray into the business of managing boutique hotels. Well, I may have done it in Sri Lanka, but this is the first one in Penang. And at that time, the Minister of Tourism was a good friend of mine, and she created this category to incorporate this class of hotel because she was so excited about it and the possibilities. So, to a certain extent, that sort of encouraged me to go further into the field. So then after that, what happened? After that, it was about 2008, inscription of the World Heritage Site happened. So suddenly, I was quite shocked. But I was very happy because that meant that most of the physical and material assets, architectural assets in Georgetown would be preserved. And there's so much of it that should be preserved. And then, of course, being in the right place at the right time meant that properties popped up for sale right before my eyes. I had a lot of choice. There was one night I had a shopping list because there was this trust that was vested after 50 years. And so the owner wanted to sell everything in his, on that list that he inherited. I think there was about 40 properties there, all in the heritage zone. And so we just went to look around and bought a few properties from that list. And the first one, of course, was Mantri Mews, which was my great-grandfather's garage. It was right next door to his house, so that had a lot of connections with me. So it had a lot of emotional connection to me, that Mantri Mews, because I was cycling past that property every morning to school. You know, we went to buy ice there. The first little cubicle was selling ice. You know, there were actually people living right down that whole bank of cubicles that were meant to be for horse carriages. So I think that was very fortuitous coming across that. And, you know, one thing led to another. And I had the opportunity to sell Clove Hall when one of the guests who stayed there wanted to buy it. So when the World Heritage Site was inscribed and we knew what the boundaries were, I just didn't want to have a property that was outside of the zone. Because if you were a cultural traveler, you were a cultural tourist, and you came here because of the UNESCO brand, you certainly wouldn't want to stay outside of the zone. You know, why would you do that? So it's an easy decision to make for me to agree to sell that and reinvest the money back into Georgetown. The other fortuitous thing that happened to me was when I had the Clove Hall, I wanted to pair it with something up on the hill. And that was the romance of having a few nights down here and a few nights up in the hill. And I had approached the new government that had come in 2008 about leasing the old Crag Hotel, because the Crag Hotel was also developed by the Saki brothers. So to me, you know, the whole romance of that whole connection was there, and I just thought, wow, wouldn't it be wonderful? And I spent so much time up there trekking around that property, which was last occupied and used during the shooting of Indochine in the year 2000. So this was about 2008, 2009. And I thought, wow, that's amazing, you know, that property, the position, and it still is an amazing property, but my terms, or the government's terms, was not good enough for me to take it on. And so I turned my attention to Georgetown because I knew that had hit a roadblock. And also after selling Clove Hall, that was not so important as a part of the whole experience anymore. So by turning away from Penang Hill, it meant that I could then focus on Georgetown totally. I was looking at this row of terraces after buying Mantri Mews. I was looking at this row of terraces up the road from Mantri Mews. There was a for sale sign out there. It was completely dilapidated, opened up to the elements, and I thought, wow, what a great opportunity. At first my mission was about getting people to come back and live in Georgetown. I didn't realize that it was to be such an uphill battle because, you know, it happened everywhere in the world that people wanted to move back into the inner city, but not here. I didn't have any neighbors for many, many years, and I still don't actually, because people only could see themselves doing business in Georgetown. They couldn't see themselves living here. And I was trying to get into their mindset to understand what was going on. But, you know, being away from the place for so long, I failed to understand that the Georgetown had all sorts of connotations for local people. It meant that it was associated with the triads. It meant that it was all dirty and crumbling old houses. It also meant that it was commercial and that people were doing business here rather than living here for a long time, when it actually started out being residential in the 19th century. Well, this part of the street was residential anyway. So, and people were very obsessed with their cars, and not having off-street parking was a real mental block for a lot of people to buy into this town, into Georgetown. And I think it's because of the lack of public transport or something. I don't know. I don't find cars that important. So to me, parking the car outside is not a huge problem. In fact, in Sydney, where I was last based, most places did not have off-street parking. You know, we had to go and find and pay for a car parking spot from someone's spare little plot of land, or you know, go to a public car parking spot, garage or something like that. So to me, those issues were not a real issue. And I think also, you know, there's all this superstition about old buildings being haunted. You know, too many Asian ghost stories have to be responsible for some things. Anyway, this row of properties that's called Seven Terraces, it took me 2 years to negotiate because it started off being too expensive for what it was. And then the market slowly moved up to what they wanted for it. And they, to be fair, they never budged from their price. They always stuck onto that price. And when it got to that price, the market, I then agreed to buy it at that price. You know, looking back, it's ridiculous. You know, it was such little money, it was ridiculous. But at that time, you know, I just didn't want to pay over the odds because there was nothing left there. There was very little left in the property. So I just valued it as for land value. And you know, for the heritage zone in Georgetown, any investor was penalized when you buy into the heritage zone. By that I mean that you had to give up your development rights completely because you can only develop within the envelope of the property, or if it was deep enough property, you could put up to a certain level. I think it's 5 stories or 18 meters, that's right. But very seldom can you, do you have properties that are that deep that you can have that 5 stories without breaking up the roof line. So the roof line had to continue its pitch back up to the 18 meter level. So you couldn't go like that. So there was really no encouragement and no incentive. And a lot of roadblocks, a lot of do not come here like signs when you wanted to buy into the heritage zone. And also in those early days, people did not know what the rules were, what the requirements were. I don't know whether I would do it, frankly, if I knew how difficult it was. And it still is, you know. So I think it's because people don't understand what a living heritage zone is all about. You know, we're not conserving the pyramids here. We're not conserving Angkor Wat. We are recreating a living city within a heritage zone. So it has to have all the needs and conveniences of what people expect these days. You know, en suites, good plumbing. I mean, those two lines, those two issues alone would put you off completely. For example, in this street, we're not connected to the main sewage line. And it's not going to happen anytime soon. So, you know, you've got to put in very large septics to process the waste. You to preserve everything that was there and there's really a conflict. Septics and en-suites, that's right. Septics and en-suites were the two issues that people wanted or required these days. Now, these old houses had one bathroom at the back, one toilet at the back of the house, like all Victorian houses in England. And that was really a challenge to deal with all of that. And the Heritage Department that wasn't sure what we should be doing. All those departments really were not talking to each other in those days. We had to change the building from a residential to a commercial use, and that meant that we were under the preview of a building department that was assessing us like a new build, like building a new hotel. So, these issues are formidable and take a long time to resolve, and in the end, they're not resolved. They are swept under the carpet, and we have to do double the amount, cost us double the amount to please everyone. Just to give you an example, they wanted to have the original floorboards on the upstairs. By the Heritage Department, they don't want us to change that. That's fair enough, but when you convert into a commercial use, you need to have fire-rated floors. So what it meant for us was we had to put in fire-rated floors and then put back the wooden floors. So it's double the cost. It's all these issues that basically add on to the cost of restoring these houses, and yet we have our hands tied in terms of not being able to extract value by getting the density, the plot ratio up. So we have the most expensive hotel rooms in terms of market capitalization per room in Malaysia, because each of these houses that we have would have, in 7 terraces we have 2 suites per house. Each house is at least worth $1 million US. That's $500,000 US per room. So it is quite a big capital commitment to do heritage properties in the inner city. I don't think I'm going to see a lot of new investment in here until something changes, because it just is not feasible. So I'm glad that I've done it when I did, because it was still affordable. But with the property prices and the restrictions and the costs involved, it's just not feasible to do it at the moment. The style of the hotel, basically, I looked at what was unique about Georgetown. Why did people come here? What was unique in terms of the architectural inventory here? Georgetown was very much a 19th century mercantile port. And you have a lot of merchants' houses, middle class housing, and subsequently, when wealth was created, more wealth was created, these houses were decorated to an inch of its life. I think the peak period was the 1920s. So when I looked at these shells, I thought, it's obvious that we have to create what was sensitive to the period, what was sensitive to what was here before. And because I grew up in these homes, it was just very natural for me to know how to fit them out, how the layout, how the house was used, and it was just natural for me. It didn't seem like it didn't seem right to sort of go completely modern minimalism in the interiors. I mean, that was one way I could have gone, but I felt that it was my duty to show people the beauty and the grace and the glamour of these houses when they were done up. I think, that was my purpose and my dream, was to create the Peranakan era or recreate the Peranakan era for travelers to step back in time. I think for me, when I came back to Georgetown and I started to do all these things and started to have an archive of the objects that went into the interiors, my family said to me, this is what you're meant to do. This is your destiny. And I thought about it, and I think it was totally correct, because if I had stayed here, I wouldn't have had the global perspective. I wouldn't have had the design input from so many different eras, because I had not traveled so extensively then, to have a sense of what Peranakan style was. And Peranakan style was about really 19th century, Victorian. It's about eclectic mix of elements. It was about the cross-cultural influences of the British being here, the Chinese bringing their heritage in here, and the local influences being the Malay influence. So, it's a very unique culture, and being able to identify and realize the melange of styles and the beauty of combining them, I think I wouldn't have been able to do that if I had stayed here. I had to go around, to be let loose around the world, to do what I had to do, to sort of like come back and understand and put it all in perspective. I think that my grandmother's role was very much in opening my eyes to the beauty of Peranakan furniture, porcelain, lifestyle. It was all about, she was lamenting about the end of an amazing period. And it was a very short period. Peranakan period, I would call it, is basically late 19th century to the Second World War. So I always said it spanned 3 generations. And the end of the war was like, Second World War was like the end of the Peranakan period. People didn't have the money, the time, or the will to continue that lifestyle. So to me, it was all about trying to relive that period for her. When I was listening to her stories when I was a child. So, that's basically what drives me. And being a Peranakan as well, I think that, I never thought it was unique or anything different, because we only mixed around our families and friends who were all, from the same genre of background. So we didn't think it was anything unique until, you put it in a global perspective and you think, wow, what an unusual mix of cultures it was. Peranakan food, when you look into it, was such an amazing fusion of East cuisines, Chinese with Malay, Chinese with Indian. It was such a unique combination at such an early part of, awareness. The awareness on the combinations was so early 19th century. Early 20th century, late 19th century. Who was so focused on cuisine in Asia at the time? I think the challenges at the moment in terms of adaptive reuse of these houses is very real, because how do you justify the price of a building, the value of a building? It's basically what income you can generate from that building, right? So there are very limited uses for these buildings if you're not going to use them as a home. So for commercial purposes, how many cafes, how many restaurants does one need in a city, right? How many museums, how many, I don't know what these buildings are used for. I mean, I haven't seen a really good use of some of these buildings in terms of something that I've seen that made me sit up and say, wow, that's a great idea. I think that the challenge is how to use these buildings and how to generate a return. So the problem is, how do you generate a return from a building that is very restrictive in terms of what you can use from it because of the zoning and etc. I think those are complex issues that the council really has to sit down and work this out if they really want this to be a thriving city. It has to be a mixed use. I think you've got to attract people back to live in the inner city, into all these old houses. How do you maintain these houses? Well, if you don't get a proper income from these houses, it's impossible to maintain them. That's the key issue. Because the rental return versus the value of the property after you restore it there's really a big mismatch. It's very low, but I suppose we're lucky in that in the current period, interest rates are very low. So, it doesn't look that out of skew with expected returns, but it's hard to see it going up because there's strange dynamics in Georgetown that create the situation where rentals are very low. It's because half of the inventory in Georgetown are owned by associations and clan houses and guilds and whatever that had zero cost in their books for these properties that were given to them or that were built in the 19th century. So for them, they actually just wanted to get any return. So that is one factor that is unusual in terms of returns being generated and also what that means to preserving and maintaining these houses. I think, okay, how do you maintain these houses? You need people to live in them. Basically, if you don't, they crumble and they deteriorate very fast because, there's this thing about termites I was telling you about how they know when no one's there. So they invade the place when they don't hear any vibrations, anybody walking around. And, it's impossible to get rid of them. They are everywhere. And they will always channel their search for food in the right places. I mean, even during the movement control order, there are rooms that we haven't been into for like a month or 2 months, and you start seeing that decay happening. They are so brilliant at it. So to maintain these houses, we need people to live in it. And I think that, you need to have more people living here to support the services which are dying out anyway. So it's a chicken and egg situation. You get more people to come in to live here, but people don't want to spend money to renovate the houses. They don't own it. Maybe so one of the things that we could do is to have strata laws to divide up these houses into smaller spaces and make it more affordable. And that would definitely encourage people to come in here. Some sort of incentive that needs to be provided for investors in the long term in terms of discounts on rates or whatever, so that people are incentivized to invest and restore these houses. At the moment, there's nothing. So if I bought the same property just outside the zone, which is like 2 streets away, I could redevelop it into a 10-story building. And so financially, it doesn't make sense to buy into here, into the inner city. So I think that these houses would just crumble and fall down and get termite infested if we don't address these issues. I mean, we had the swiftlet bird's nest issue a decade ago, and that was surprisingly solved by China banning the imports of bird's nests from Malaysia because it contained too many chemicals in the processing. So that one act alone basically got rid of all the bird's nest swiftlets houses from the inner city of Georgetown. It was also the economic impact because property prices were so high that when they sold the house here, they could buy 10 houses on the mainland for tank, to address these issues of how to compensate investors and how to get people to come back in to live here and how to make it vibrant. At the moment you walk around at night, it's dead. I have put a lot of thought into it because I keep having people who ask me this question all the time and about what's going to happen to all these things. Well, I think I've spoken about Jim Thompson and his legacy and his house. And I think that's a very good model of, but it takes a beneficiary that is very committed to keeping the legacy alive, to keep that whole Jim Thompson house running and operating like as if he's just stepped out for a moment. It's because the brand of merchandise and silk and whatever that he's created is so valuable that they needed to keep his legacy alive, personal legacy alive, as part of the branding for, the products and the business. And to a certain extent, it's a business model that I want to emulate, in that I want to have a foundation that looks after my collections. And I would say that, my Peranakan collection of objects is quite extensive and that it should be preserved for future generations. And then who's going to do it? Well, we can entrust it to, we can always pick the first generation of trustees. What happens after that? It depends on how committed those people are to your cause and your vision. And really, we have no control over that. I have seen so many different models. I think the models that I'm very impressed with are the clan houses, and how the clan houses that were created 100 to 150 years ago, how they continue the mission and how the assets are maintained and how they continue the cultural traditions that were brought in from China and continuing for the clan. And I think that, I'm looking at all the different models to see which one is the most suitable. I wouldn't say the best, it's the most suitable. And whether, there'll be enough funding to keep it going. I think those are the major issues. And I don't think that I am going to be looking for public funding, as in government funding, I've got to do it all privately because that's the only way you can assure yourself of the independence and the integrity of what you're doing. So, those things are in place, and I hope that future generations can share and can learn from the collection that I've accumulated and assembled. And I'm doing a lot of archiving of videos of our cultural intangible practices as well, so that there's a reference in the future for all of that. We can only do our best planning, and I suppose because I'm so aware of all of this that I can execute it in my lifetime, but whether we can continue it can be continued, is something that is up to, something in the future that's hard to see. But the intentions definitely has to be there, and the planning has to be there to put in place the checks and balances. Oh, no, it doesn't, because it doesn't give me sleepless nights, because when you're gone, you're gone. When you're dead, you're dead. You can only do what you can now, and and do what at least you've thought about it, you planned it. It's not being irresponsible. So, yeah, that's. I don't have sleepless nights about it. I enjoy this when I'm alive. I'm enjoying this in my lifetime. I'm going to have a dinner party tonight using all my heritage porcelain, and it's about living the life of a Peranakan gentleman in my lifetime. And what happens in the future, I can only put, as I said, all the safeguards in place. How do you know? How do you read the future, right? It's impossible.